Welcome to our channel, Crime Loom, the place where true crime stories come alive. From daring jewel heists to mysterious legends, every video uncovers the secrets hidden in the shadows. Stay with us, because here, every crime tells a story. Some people wear masks so perfect, even those closest to them can't see the truth. In Maplewood, Daniel Cross was that man, a friendly neighbor, a trusted coach, the one everyone turned to in times of fear. He walked the streets with a smile, shook hands, comforted grieving families, and no one ever suspected the darkness he carried inside. But behind closed doors, Daniel lived a double life. One side of him was the town's hero. The other side was a predator hiding in plain sight. For years he fooled everyone, leaving no trace, no slip, until one tiny mistake changed everything. This is the chilling story of how a perfect mask cracked, how a community realized the man they admired was their greatest threat, and how one small error exposed the monster who had been living among them all along. The town of Maplewood was the kind of place where people trusted each other. Neighbors left their doors unlocked, kids played in the park until sunset, and shopkeepers greeted customers by name. Everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. In a place like Maplewood, danger was something people read about in newspapers from faraway cities, never something they imagined could be hiding in their own streets. Daniel Cross was the perfect neighbor. He was polite, friendly, and always willing to lend a hand. He coached the youth football team on weekends, volunteered at community events, and even helped elderly neighbors carry groceries. People said he had a kind smile and a calm presence. Parents trusted him with their children, and friends invited him to barbecues. If there was anyone people thought they could rely on, it was Daniel. But behind that smile was a darkness no one could see. Daniel had secrets that he guarded carefully, secrets that would shock the entire town when they finally came to light. For years, he managed to fool everyone around him, hiding in plain sight. He played the role of the perfect man, so well that even the police never thought to look his way. The first strange event happened in late autumn. A young woman named Claire disappeared after leaving work one evening. She had told her friend she was heading home, but she never arrived. Her car was found abandoned near the edge of town, the keys still in the ignition. The police searched the area, but no clues were found. People in Maplewood whispered nervously, but most believed it was a random event, something that would not happen again. Daniel joined the search party for Claire. He handed out flyers, walked through the woods with flashlights, and comforted her family when they cried. He seemed genuinely concerned, telling others how shocking it was that something like this could happen in their quiet town. His presence calmed people. If Daniel was involved, they thought, then everything was being taken care of. Weeks passed, and then another person vanished. This time it was a young man named Peter, who was last seen leaving a local pub. His friends assumed he had walked home, but he never made it. Again, the town searched, and again, no answers were found. Fear began to grow. People started locking their doors at night. Parents told their children to come home before dark. Daniel was always there. He stood beside worried families, offered words of support, and even attended candlelight vigils for the missing. Reporters covering the story often filmed him in the background, his arm around a grieving neighbor, his face serious and sympathetic. No one looked at him with suspicion. In fact, many people said they felt safer just knowing Daniel was around. But Daniel had carefully built that image. He knew exactly how to act, what to say, and how to make himself seem trustworthy. For him, it was a game. He enjoyed the control, the feeling of being admired by the very people he was deceiving. At night, when he was alone, the mask slipped. He sat in his darkened house thinking about the missing, replaying their final moments in his mind. It was the part of himself no one could see, the part he kept locked away. Detective Laura Hayes was assigned to the case after the second disappearance. She was known for her persistence, and though the trail was cold, she believed there was more to the story than random vanishings. She interviewed families, retraced last steps, and reviewed CCTV footage from shops near where the victims were, last seen. Nothing stood out. No strange cars, no clear suspects. The cases looked clean, almost too clean. Laura noticed something unsettling during her interviews. People always mentioned Daniel. "Daniel helped us look," one mother said. "Daniel organized the flyers," another added. His name kept appearing, but always in the role of a helper, never as someone suspicious. Still, it stuck in her mind. Why was he always there? Why was he so close to every case? Months went by, and the town's fear deepened. More people disappeared. Each time, Daniel was there, searching, comforting, pretending. People admired him even more for his commitment. "If only we had more men like Daniel," one father said during a town meeting. What no one knew was that Daniel was careful. He planned everything. He made sure never to leave traces, never to be caught on camera, never to let anyone see the other side of him. He lived for the thrill of being two people at once, the trusted neighbor and the hidden predator. He kept trophies from his victims, small items tucked away in a box under his bed. He would take them out late at night, holding them in his hands as he smiled in the dark. Detective Laura kept digging. She didn't yet know Daniel's secret, but she sensed something was off. People could lie, she knew, and appearances could deceive. She began to look at the case differently, wondering if the person everyone trusted most could be the one responsible. It was just a thought, nothing she could prove, but it stayed with her. Daniel, meanwhile, grew more confident. He had fooled them all for so long that he believed he could never be caught. He told himself he was smarter than the police, smarter than the detectives, smarter than the entire town. His mask had become his greatest weapon, and he wore it proudly. But even the most careful people make mistakes, and for Daniel, that mistake was coming. A single small error, so simple yet so crucial, would shatter his perfect disguise and bring his world crashing down. For now, though, Maplewood still believed in their hero, the man who coached their children, who walked the streets with them at night, who smiled and shook their hands. He was the last person anyone suspected, and that was exactly what made him so dangerous. The winter in Maplewood was colder than usual that year. Snow lined the streets, Christmas lights hung from the houses, and children built snowmen in front yards. On the surface, the town looked cheerful, but beneath the surface there was fear. Too many people had disappeared in too short a time, and no one had answers. Detective Laura Hayes spent most of her nights in the station, staring at files spread across her desk. Each case was like a puzzle with missing pieces. Claire, Peter, and now two more names had been added: Emily and Joseph. Emily vanished while walking home from her friend's house, and Joseph disappeared after finishing a late shift at the factory. The police had nothing, no witnesses, no evidence, no clear suspects. It was as if the victims had simply vanished into thin air. Daniel Cross kept up his perfect performance. He helped shovel snow for neighbors, handed out blankets at the community shelter, and even hosted a small Christmas party at his house. Families gathered in his living room, children laughing and adults sipping hot cocoa. No one suspected that under the tree in the corner, hidden inside a wrapped box he had placed himself, were items he had stolen from his victims. To him, they were trophies disguised as gifts, and no one noticed. Laura continued her investigation, driven by instinct more than proof. She kept seeing Daniel's name in her notes. It wasn't that he had done anything wrong. In fact, he was always described as kind and helpful. But that was the problem. He was always there, always close to the families, always near the searches, always at the center of the town's response. One evening, she attended another vigil for the missing. Candles flickered in the cold wind as people prayed and cried. Laura scanned the crowd, and there he was. Daniel standing near the front holding a candle, his face solemn. He comforted a grieving mother, whispered something in her ear that made her nod, and then bowed his head in silence. To everyone else, he looked like a hero. But to Laura, it felt too perfect, too rehearsed. That night, she wrote his name again in her notebook, circling it twice. She didn't have proof, but her gut told her not to ignore him. Meanwhile, Daniel felt untouchable. The more people praised him, the more confident he became. In his private moments, he laughed at the idea that the police were looking for a stranger. They had no idea the man they shook hands with every day was the one they wanted. He kept his trophies hidden, taking them out one by one late at night. A necklace, a scarf, a wallet. Each one reminded him of how clever he was, how easy it was to fool everyone. But cracks began to appear in his perfect mask. One night, Daniel followed another victim, a young woman named Sarah who was walking home from work. He planned carefully, as he always did. But this time something unexpected happened. A man walking his dog turned the corner and saw Daniel too close to Sarah. Daniel smiled, pretending to ask for directions, and Sarah hurried away. The man didn't think much of it at the time, but later, when he heard Sarah had gone missing, he remembered the strange encounter. He told the police, describing a tall man with dark hair and a calm voice. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was the first witness account they had. When Laura read the report, her heart raced. The description was vague, but it matched Daniel. She knew she couldn't act yet, but it gave her more reason to watch him closely. She requested his background file and found little of note. No criminal record, steady work history, well-liked in the community. It was the kind of profile that would make anyone seem ordinary, and that was exactly what unsettled her. Daniel noticed the police circling closer. He saw the way Laura's eyes lingered on him when they crossed paths. For the first time, he felt the faint sting of risk. But instead of backing away, he doubled down. He attended more community meetings, spoke louder in support of the victims, families, and even offered to donate money for the searches. He was determined to keep his mask intact. Still, in private, he grew restless. His trophies gave him comfort, but they also reminded him of the danger. If anyone ever found them, everything would unravel. One night, as he sat in his dark living room, he considered burning them, destroying all the evidence. But he couldn't. The trophies were too important to him. They were proof of his secret life, the part of him no one else could see. Detective. Laura pushed harder. She began discreetly following Daniel's routines, noting where he went and how long he stayed. She saw him walking late at night alone, with no clear destination. She saw him carrying bags that seemed heavier than groceries. She saw him stop at places near where the victims had vanished, his eyes scanning the streets as if reliving something. Her suspicions grew stronger, but she still lacked proof. She needed a mistake. Something small, but undeniable. She knew that even the most careful people slipped eventually, and Daniel was about to slip. One snowy evening, he left his house quickly, forgetting to lock the back door. A curious neighbor noticed it slightly ajar, unusual for a man who was always so neat and precise. The neighbor stepped inside to check if Daniel was all right. He didn't go far, just into the kitchen, but what he saw made him uneasy. On the counter, half covered by a cloth, was a necklace. It looked familiar, too much like the one Emily's family had described. The neighbor quietly left, locking the door behind him, but the image stayed in his mind. The next day, he mentioned it to the police. Laura listened carefully. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't proof yet, but it was close. A personal item connected to a victim, found in Daniel's home. If she could confirm it, she would finally have the lead she needed. Daniel, unaware of the neighbor's discovery, continued his routine. He walked through town with the same calm smile, greeting people, shaking hands, pretending to be their protector. Everyone still believed in him. Everyone still trusted him. But the truth was closing in, and it would take only one tiny mistake, a door left unlocked, an item left in plain sight, to finally tear away the mask he had worn for so long. The tension in Maplewood grew heavier with every passing week. More people whispered about the disappearances, and parents kept their children inside after dark. The once cheerful town felt different now, like a shadow had settled over it. And, in the center of it all, Daniel Cross kept up his mask. He walked the streets with calm confidence, stopping to chat with shopkeepers and neighbors. He helped an elderly woman clear ice from her driveway, carried groceries for a single mother, and smiled warmly at everyone who greeted him. On the outside, he looked like a man holding the community together during dark times. On the inside, he laughed at how easily they believed his act. Detective Laura Hayes was no longer convinced by appearances. The neighbor's report about the necklace still echoed in her mind. She decided it was time to get closer to Daniel. She arranged a casual interview under the pretense of asking community volunteers about their roles in the searches. When she visited his house, Daniel welcomed her in with a smile, offering tea as if nothing in the world was wrong. His home looked neat and ordinary. Bookshelves lined the living room, family photos decorated the walls, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. It was the kind of house that would make anyone feel safe. But Laura noticed the details. A small scratch near the back door's lock, a faint smell of bleach in the kitchen, and a nervous twitch in Daniel's hand when she mentioned Emily's name. He answered her questions smoothly, talking about how he cared for the town and how much he wanted the missing people to be found. He sounded genuine, almost too genuine, like a man rehearsing his lines. Laura kept her tone light, but inside she was watching every move he made. Later, as she left, she glanced back at the house. She knew something was hidden there. She just didn't know where. Daniel felt the pressure building. He had noticed Laura's sharp eyes, the way she studied him more closely than others did. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of unease. But instead of slowing down, he grew bolder. He told himself he was untouchable, that he had fooled them for too long to ever be caught. At night, he still sat with his trophies. He ran, his fingers over the necklace, the wallet, the scarf. Each one reminded him of the people who trusted him, the people who had never seen his true face until it was too late. He whispered to himself in the dark, enjoying the memories. It was his secret world, one he thought no one would ever find, but mistakes were piling up. One cold evening, Daniel followed another victim, a university student named Rachel. He thought he was careful, but a security camera caught him in the background of a street near her last known location. The footage was grainy, his face blurred, but the tall figure, the calm walk, and the familiar jacket matched him. When the police reviewed the footage, Laura's suspicion deepened. She froze, the frame staring at the figure. It wasn't clear enough for proof, but she knew. Her instincts screamed that it was Daniel. She filed it as potential evidence, keeping it close while she searched for more. Meanwhile, Daniel's confidence blinded him. At a community meeting, he stood up and spoke passionately about how the police needed to work harder. "We can't let this monster keep taking our friends," he said, his voice strong. People clapped, some even thanking him afterward for his words. To the crowd, he was a leader. To Laura, he was a liar, standing in plain sight. At the end of the meeting, she approached him casually. "You were seen near Rachel's last known location," she said, watching his reaction carefully. For a fraction of a second, Daniel's mask slipped. His eyes widened, his jaw tightened, and then he smiled. "Oh, yes," he replied smoothly. "I was walking home that night. I didn't realize it was so close to where she disappeared." It was a believable excuse, but Laura saw through it. That tiny flicker of panic told her everything she needed. He was hiding something. and she was closer than ever to proving it. Daniel went home that night unsettled. For the first time, he felt the walls closing in. He recorded his thoughts in a notebook he kept hidden under his bed. "They're watching. Me now," he wrote. "The detective is too close, but she has nothing. She will never have anything." He tried to reassure himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his control was slipping. Then came the mistake that would change everything. It was a snowy night when Daniel left his house to take out the trash. He carried a bag filled with scraps he thought would never be noticed: torn fabric, a stained glove, and a broken watch he had kept too long. He threw it into a bin at the edge of the street, not realizing that the police had begun quietly watching his home. The next morning, officers collected the trash as part of their surveillance. They found the watch, the glove, and pieces of fabric that matched descriptions given by victims' families. It was the first physical evidence linking Daniel to the disappearances. When Laura saw the items laid out on the evidence table, she felt a surge of determination. This was the break she had been waiting for. It wasn't enough for an arrest yet, but it was proof that Daniel wasn't as flawless as he believed. His tiny mistake, throwing away what he thought was worthless, had opened the door. Daniel, unaware of what had been discovered, continued his act. He shook hands, smiled, and walked through Maplewood like a man admired by all. But the walls around him were closing in, inch by inch, and soon the mask he had worn so perfectly would begin to crack beyond repair. Snow melted in Maplewood as winter gave way to spring. Flowers began to bloom, children returned to the parks, and the streets slowly filled with life again. But beneath the sunlight, the fear had not faded. People still spoke in hushed tones about the disappearances. And quietly, the police were closer than ever to the man who had fooled them all. Detective Laura Hayes sat in her office, staring at the evidence table. The broken watch, the stained glove, and the torn fabric were sealed, in clear bags. To anyone else, they looked like scraps of trash, but to Laura, they were gold. Each piece connected Daniel to the missing. She couldn't yet prove beyond doubt that the items belonged to the victims, but she knew she was on the right path. She spent long hours tracing the items. The watch matched a description given by Joseph's mother. The glove resembled one Emily had been seen wearing in a photograph. It wasn't absolute proof, but it painted a picture that placed Daniel Cross at the center of it all. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his act, but the cracks in his mask were beginning to show. Neighbors still praised him, still invited him for dinner, still trusted him with their children. But there were moments when his calm slipped. A sharp word to a curious child, a glare at a neighbor who asked too many questions, a flash of anger when someone suggested the police were closing in. At night, alone in his house, Daniel felt the pressure. He paced the floors, his trophies, hidden under the bed, pulling at his thoughts. He told himself he was safe, that no one could touch him. But deep down, he knew the detective was closing the gap. One evening, Laura decided to push harder. She visited Daniel at his home again, this time without notice. He answered the door with his usual smile, though his eyes looked tired. She asked if she could come in to talk about the ongoing searches. He agreed, but there was hesitation in his voice. As they sat in the living room, Laura scanned the space carefully. The house was neat, almost too neat, like someone had spent hours scrubbing every surface. She noticed a faint scent of bleach again, stronger this time. Her eyes lingered on a small box tucked halfway under the sofa, but Daniel quickly shifted his foot to block her view. They spoke for nearly an hour. Daniel talked about his concern for the town, about how he wanted the community to feel safe, again. His words were polished, but Laura listened more to what he didn't say. The pauses, the changes in his tone, the slight twitch in his jaw when certain names were mentioned. When she left, she felt more certain than ever. He was hiding something in that house, Daniel knew it too. As soon as the door closed, he rushed to the box under the sofa and carried it upstairs to the attic. Inside were items too dangerous to keep in plain sight: jewelry, photographs, and personal belongings from the missing. He cursed himself for leaving it where the detective might have seen it. For the first time, his careful planning felt sloppy. The police surveillance around Daniel's home grew tighter. Unmarked cars parked on the street. Officers rotated shifts, watching him day and night. Daniel noticed. He saw the same faces too often, the same cars moving slowly past his house. He felt trapped, and the walls of his perfect disguise began to close in. At the next community meeting, Daniel tried to reassert his mask. He stood and gave a speech about unity, about not letting fear control the town. People applauded, grateful for his words. But Laura was there too, watching closely. She saw the sweat on his brow, the stiffness in his movements. His performance wasn't flawless anymore. The mask was slipping, even if the crowd didn't notice. Then came another mistake. Late. One night, Daniel drove out of town thinking he wasn't being followed. He carried a bag with him, heavy and awkward. He parked near a wooded area and walked into the trees. But the police were ready. Surveillance officers followed at a distance, recording his every move. Through binoculars, they saw him dig into the ground and bury the bag. The next morning, detectives returned to the site. They dug up the bag and opened it. Inside were more trophies, items belonging to the victims, each one more damning than the last. A bracelet engraved with Claire's name, a wallet with Joseph's ID, a scarf that Emily's mother had described in detail. Laura stared at the items laid out on the table, her hands trembling slightly. This was it. This was the evidence she needed. Daniel's tiny mistakes were no longer tiny. They were unraveling the mask he had built for years. Back in his home, Daniel sensed the end approaching. He looked at himself in the mirror, studying the face that had fooled so many. For years, he had played the hero, the friend, the neighbor everyone trusted. Now, the mirror showed cracks he could no longer hide. He whispered to himself, "They'll never prove it. They'll never see the real me." But the truth was already out. The detective saw it, the police saw it, and soon the whole town would see it too. The news of another discovery shook Maplewood. Though the police did not release all the details, word spread that items had been found in the woods, items belonging to the missing. Families whispered, neighbors gossiped, and fear turned into suspicion. People began to look at each other differently, wondering if the person next door was hiding secrets. Detective Laura Hayes kept the evidence quiet, but she knew it was enough to move forward. The bracelet, the wallet, the scarf. Each piece tied Daniel to the disappearances. It wasn't yet a confession, but it was more than suspicion. It was proof that he had slipped, that his careful mask had cracks big enough to see. The police planned their next steps carefully. They couldn't rush. If they moved too soon, Daniel might find a way to escape or destroy more evidence. Surveillance continued, officers keeping a close eye on his every move. They noted his routines: when he left his house, when he returned, where he drove. Daniel, meanwhile, felt the pressure growing. He could sense the eyes on him, the quiet stares of people who once smiled freely. At the grocery store, he noticed a woman whisper to her friend and glance at him. At the park, children no longer ran to him with the same joy. He told himself it was paranoia, but deep down, he knew the truth. The town was starting to doubt their hero. At night, he paced his living room, muttering under his breath. He still had trophies hidden in his attic, items that could destroy him if found. He considered moving them, but with the police so close, it felt too risky. He thought about burning the house down, but that would draw even more suspicion. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. Detective Laura pushed harder. She ordered a search warrant, building the case with every piece of evidence collected. The judge reviewed the files carefully. the photographs of the items found, the reports from surveillance, and the witness accounts. Finally, the warrant was signed. The police would search Daniel's home, but before the raid could happen, the town saw another side of their trusted neighbor. At a community vigil for the missing, Daniel stood near the front as he always did. But this time his mask slipped. A father of one of the missing children shouted at the crowd, demanding answers from the police. "Where is my son? Why can't you find him?" he cried. The crowd grew restless, emotions spilling over. Daniel stepped forward, raising his hands to calm them. "We must trust the process," he said, his voice steady. But his words didn't soothe them. Instead, people turned to him with anger. One woman shouted, "Why are you always here? Always in the middle of everything?" The crowd murmured in agreement. For the first time, Daniel felt the shift. Suspicion had turned toward him. He smiled weakly, trying to maintain control, but the moment burned in his mind. The perfect mask he had worn for so long was slipping in front of everyone. That night he sat in his attic, surrounded by his trophies. He picked up the bracelet, turning it over in his hands. He whispered, "They'll never take this from me." But even as he said it, he knew the end was near. The next morning, the police moved in. It was early, the sky still gray, when officers surrounded his house. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, shocked to see flashing lights outside Daniel's home. The man they trusted, the man they thought was their protector, was now the focus of a major raid. Daniel opened the door calmly when they knocked, pretending to be surprised. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice even. But inside, his heart raced. He knew what they were about to find. Detective Laura led the team inside. Officers spread through the rooms, searching every corner. In the attic, they found the box. Inside were photographs, jewelry, wallets, and clothing, trophies from the missing. Each item matched descriptions families had given. It was undeniable. When Laura placed the box on the table in front of Daniel, his calm mask finally cracked. His eyes darted to the items, then to her face. For a brief moment, his lips trembled. Then he leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. "You think this proves everything?" he asked. But it did. Word spread quickly through Maplewood. The hero was not a hero at all. The man who had fooled them for years was the one responsible for their darkest fears. Families wept, neighbors cursed his name, and the town that once praised Daniel Cross now spat it with disgust. Daniel sat in an interrogation room that evening, silent as the evidence piled up. Detective Laura watched him closely, waiting for him to speak. She didn't need a confession anymore, but she wanted to hear him break. Finally, after hours of silence, Daniel leaned forward. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said. "I was careful. I was perfect." Laura's jaw tightened. "You made one mistake," she said. "And that mistake gave you away." Daniel's smile faded, his mask shattered. For the first time, he looked small, cornered, and powerless. The man who once fooled an entire town was now just another criminal facing justice. But the story wasn't over. The trial was still to come. The families still needed answers, and the truth of what Daniel had done would soon shock the world beyond Maplewood. The arrest of Daniel Cross spread through Maplewood like wildfire. By the afternoon, every news channel carried the story. Neighbors stood on the sidewalks as police cars lined the street, their flashing lights bouncing off windows. People shook, their heads in disbelief. Some wept, others cursed, and a few stood in silence, trying to process that the man they once admired was now exposed as a predator. At the police station, Daniel sat in an interrogation room, hands cuffed to the table. He wore the same faint smile he had carried for years, though his eyes betrayed the pressure. Detective Laura Hayes entered with a folder of evidence. She placed photographs of the trophies on the table, one by one. A necklace, a bracelet, a wallet, a scarf. Items the families of victims had described countless times. "These were in your attic," Laura said firmly. Daniel looked at the photographs for a moment, then leaned back. "Anyone could have put them there," he said calmly. "You don't have proof they belonged to me." But Laura knew the game he was playing. He thrived on control, on turning doubt into advantage. She didn't argue. Instead, she slid another photograph across the table, the broken watch taken from his trash. "This was in your bin. Do you want to explain that?" Daniel's smile faded for just a second. He looked down, then forced it back. "People throw things away all the time. That proves nothing." The interrogation stretched for hours. He dodged questions, twisted his answers, and tried to confuse the detectives. But the weight of evidence grew heavier with every passing minute. Finally, Laura leaned forward and said quietly, "You fooled them all, didn't you? The families, your neighbors, your friends, but one mistake gave you away, and that mistake will put you behind bars for the rest of your life." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence spoke louder than words. The trial began months later, and by then the story had gone national. Reporters filled. The courthouse steps, cameras flashed constantly, and Maplewood was flooded with journalists eager to capture every detail. Headlines screamed phrases like "the perfect neighbor exposed" and "one mistake that brought him down." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Families of the victims filled the benches, their faces pale with grief but strong with determination. They wanted answers, and they wanted justice. Daniel sat at the defense table, dressed in a suit provided by the court. He looked calm, collected, almost smug, as if the trial were just another stage for his performance. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically. They showed the items found in his attic, the bag buried in, the woods, the broken watch from his trash. They presented witness statements, including the neighbor who saw the necklace in his kitchen and the man who saw him too close to Rachel on the night she disappeared. They replayed the grainy footage from the security camera, pointing out his familiar jacket and posture. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. The defense tried to fight back. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that none of it directly proved Daniel had harmed anyone. They argued he was being framed. That, the town's fear had turned him into an easy target. But their arguments fell flat. The jury listened intently, their eyes often drifting back to Daniel, searching for signs of guilt. Families took the stand, their voices breaking as they described their loved ones. A mother held up a photo of her daughter Emily, her hands shaking. "She trusted this man," she said, pointing at Daniel. "We all did, and now we know what he truly is." The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of quiet sobs. Daniel showed no emotion. He sat still, his eyes cold, his lips pressed into a thin line. Only once did he lean forward, whispering something to his lawyer. To the families, his lack of remorse was a wound deeper than the crimes themselves. Detective Laura testified as well, explaining how the case had unfolded. She described the trail of mistakes, the unlocked door, the necklace on the counter, the items in the trash, the buried bag. "He thought he was perfect," she said firmly. "He thought he could fool us forever. But even the most careful man makes mistakes, and his mistake gave him away." Her words echoed in the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing the line for their headlines. The trial lasted weeks, each day filled with new evidence, emotional testimonies, and tense confrontations. The town watched closely, desperate for closure. Finally, the closing arguments arrived. The prosecution stood tall, their voice steady. This man wore a mask for years. He pretended to be a friend, a neighbor, a hero. But beneath that mask was a predator who thought he was untouchable. He fooled everyone, until one tiny mistake revealed the truth. That mistake led us here. And now, it is time to give the families justice. The defense repeated their claims, but the jury's faces showed little reaction. The weight of evidence was too strong. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courthouse buzzed with tension. Families held hands, reporters whispered, and Daniel sat still, his expression unreadable. Hours passed before the jury returned. Everyone rose as the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. The words echoed through the courtroom. Families wept, some collapsing into each other's arms. Reporters rushed to the phones, broadcasting the news across the country. Daniel sat motionless, his calm mask still in place. Only a faint twitch in his jaw betrayed the storm beneath. He had fooled them for so long, but now the truth was undeniable. The judge set sentencing for the following week. As Daniel was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he turned his head slightly, scanning the crowd. His eyes lingered on the families, on Laura, on the reporters, and for a brief moment, a small smile crept across his lips. It was not the smile of a man broken. It was the smile of someone who still believed he had won by being remembered. But the world no longer saw him as a hero. They saw him for what he truly was. The courthouse was packed on the day of sentencing. Families of the victims filled the benches. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. And the people of Maplewood crowded outside, waiting to hear the final words that would close the case. For months, the trial had consumed the town. Now it was coming to an end. Daniel Cross was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. He wore a plain prison uniform this time, no longer the neat suit he had used to appear respectable. His calm mask was still there, the same faint smirk he had carried for years. He looked around the room slowly, his eyes scanning the faces. Some people avoided his gaze, others glared at him with hatred. To Daniel, it didn't matter. He had their attention, and that was what he wanted. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The sentencing began with statements from the families. One by one, they stepped forward, their voices trembling but strong. Emily's mother held up her daughter's necklace, the one found in Daniel's attic. "You stole her from us," she said through tears. "But you will never steal her memory. You will sit in a cell and think of what you did, and we will keep her spirit alive." Joseph's father leaned heavily on the podium, his voice filled with anger. "You thought you were smarter than everyone. You thought you could play us all. But you made one mistake, and that mistake showed the world who you really are." Rachel's sister, younger but fierce, stared directly at Daniel. "You wanted to be remembered," she said coldly, "and you will be. But not as a hero, not as a friend. You will be remembered as the man who betrayed everyone who trusted him." The room was thick with emotion. Reporters scribbled, cameras clicked, and the sound of muffled sobs echoed against the walls. Daniel listened to it all without flinching. Sometimes his lips curled slightly, almost like a smile, but he said nothing. Finally, the judge spoke. His voice was firm and unshaking. "Daniel Cross, you are found guilty on all counts. You fooled your neighbors, your friends, and your community. You lived behind a mask of lies. But justice has removed that mask. For your crimes, you are sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." The gavel struck, sealing his fate. The families embraced each other, tears of relief falling freely. Some cried openly, others stood in silence, the weight of years of pain finally lifted, if only a little. The town of Maplewood, once fooled by Daniel's charm, now saw him for what he was, a monster hidden in plain sight. Daniel was escorted out of the courtroom. As he passed, he turned his head slightly, his calm expression still intact. A faint smirk crossed his lips, but this time it meant nothing. The world no longer believed his mask. The performance was over. In the weeks that followed, life in Maplewood slowly began to change. People still locked their doors, still looked over their shoulders, but little by little the shadow began to lift. Children returned to the parks, neighbors greeted each other again, and the town started to heal. Detective Laura Hayes was praised for her persistence. She had trusted her instincts when no one else had, and her determination had brought Daniel down. Yet even in victory, she felt the weight of the case. At night, she sometimes dreamed of his smirk, his cold eyes, and the trophies hidden in his attic. She knew she would never forget the case that defined her career. The families carried their grief, but they also carried strength. Vigils were held not just for closure, but to remind everyone that evil could hide behind the most trusted face. They wanted the world to know that masks can deceive, but truth always finds a way out. Daniel began his life sentence in a high-security prison. His days were stripped of the control he once enjoyed. No neighbors to fool, no children to coach, no community to praise him. Just gray walls, locked doors, and silence. Other inmates despised him, some mocking him, others ignoring him altogether. For the first time, he was truly powerless. But even in prison, Daniel whispered to himself. Guards reported hearing him mutter late at night, repeating words like, "I fooled them," and "They'll remember me." He still clung to the illusion that his story gave him power, but the truth was, the only thing people remembered was how one tiny mistake had destroyed him. Years later, when people in Maplewood spoke about him, they no longer called him by name. They called him the man who fooled us, or the neighbor with the mask. His identity was stripped of pride, replaced by infamy. Detective Laura visited the town square one evening, where a memorial had been built for the victims. Names were engraved into stone, candles flickered below, and families stood quietly remembering their loved ones. Laura placed a flower on the steps and stood back. She thought about the long road it had taken to reach this point, the lies, the secrets, the endless nights of doubt. And she thought about the tiny mistake that had exposed everything. The story of Daniel Cross became more than just a case. It became a lesson, a reminder that evil does not always look like evil. Sometimes it wears a smile, shakes your hand, and pretends to be your friend. But no mask lasts forever. Daniel's life faded into the silence of prison walls. The town he once fooled moved on, scarred but stronger, and the memory of his downfall lived on as a warning that no matter how perfect the lie, truth has a way of breaking through. You've just seen another chilling story from the world of true crime, but there are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to Crime Loom, and join us as we unravel more heists, mysteries, and untold legends. Don't miss what's coming next, because in the world of crime, the truth is always stranger than fiction.